I wanted to see what's your view on your leadership style and your vision of how you would work with other political candidates already in office.
Yeah.
Meaning Marty Walsh and senators and things like that.
So, I'm the only candidate in this race who's actually worked in a leadership position in state government. And I was often Governor Patrick's, so not only in my job as Secretary of Administration and Finance, where I worked closely with the legislature and other stakeholders on the stuff in my bailiwick, I was often the governor's point person for negotiating a lot of the big things we got through the legislature with the legislature. The transportation reform law in 2009 that got rid of the Turnpike Authority and more money for transportation, the healthcare cost containment law in 2012, and a number of others. And what I learned, and this is consistent with just how I operate anyway, and this is, I think, the key to life. Communication and relationships are everything, right? Transparency, being trustworthy, operating in good faith. If you disagree, being honest about that, making sure you're listening to others. Despite what our president thinks, there's no dictator in government. And that's a good thing. The governor has to work with the legislature, has to work with other stakeholders. It has to listen and understand if this is where we're trying to go. And it's important that we're trying to go somewhere. And this is my big gripe with Governor Baker, is he's not even doing this. But if this is where we're trying to go, what is that path that gets us as close to that place as possible? And it's healthy that government works that way. And I think I've proven, and I hope people in the legislature today would confirm this, that I've been effective at working that way, and that I'm someone who people trust and listens and wants to do the right thing. And that's the approach I would take as governor, and I actually think that's the approach you need to take to be an effective governor. Governor Baker, just to a point of contrast here, he likes to talk about how he's bipartisan a lot. And it's one thing to be bipartisan and to get along with everybody, but to what end? He's not asking a lot of the legislature, right? He's not pushing to try to make progress on our affordable housing crisis or our transportation crisis or you name it. And, sometimes there's healthy tension and uncomfortableness, but as long as you're approaching those discussions in good faith and everyone's putting their interests on the table and you're figuring out what's that path that's going to allow us to get to a positive result that actually moves us forward, that's what we should be doing, and that's what you should expect from your governor. And I would get along, I think, with the legislature and other key stakeholders, but while also working with them to make progress on issues that are affecting people's day-to-day lives. Yes, sir.
Hi. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
So I want to expand just a little bit on
This is Joe.
Oh, sorry.
Treasurer.
Hi, Joe. We've met before, too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I love that you advocate for 5-day weekend. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm even thinking if I get elected to a second term, we'll go to 6.
If you get elected. So, just building on that question on 2 levels. That even though we are a wonderful state, we're also a region. So how do you work with other governors in New England? We're not alone.
Yep.
Part 1. Part 2 is I have relatives in Western Mass, and when I go to Western Mass, there is a clear difference from Eastern Massachusetts.
Yeah.
You've traveled the state. What do you see as some of the challenges of being unifying us, if you will, and how do you address that?
Yeah. So on the second part, it is very true. And for those of you who have not been out to Western Massachusetts, let me confirm for you that if you go out to Western Massachusetts, they feel like state government doesn't care about them, doesn't listen to them, that they have gotten a disproportionate amount of attention and investment than the Boston area. And that is true also of the Cape and other parts of the state. I think it's really important that the governor be the governor of the whole state. And I have been trying to demonstrate through my campaign a commitment to every part of the state. I've been all over the place multiple times. And there's no substitute for understanding the unique strengths and challenges of each region and concerns without actually going and talking to people there. So as a candidate, it's been important to me to do that, and as a governor, it would be too. And I'm making a commitment. I actually think Governor Patrick was a good model for this because it was important to him to be a governor of the whole state, and I think people around the state pretty much felt like he lived up to that commitment. I will too. And part of it is recognizing, and as a candidate going around the state, you learn this very quickly in a different kind of way. We are very different around this state, and there are different strengths and challenges and concerns. And the governor needs to be aware of those differences, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, for example, to the transportation problem or to the affordable housing problem on the Cape versus Boston. We need to think differently about those. So that's different parts of the state. In terms of working with other states, it is important, and there are issues like transportation, which has regional considerations, and energy issues, which have regional considerations, and probably others. And it's really important that we try to work with our other states. Sometimes we'll be successful, sometimes we won't. There's a regional initiative referred to as RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which was implemented by Governor Patrick very early on in his term, which has resulted in all the New England states working together to reduce emissions from power plants. And it's been very successful. There are regional states that have tried to do the same thing in the transportation sector, where right now is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases of any sector. Governor Baker refused to sign on to a regional initiative to work with other states to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. I would take a very different approach as governor. That's one example of an area where, to the extent we've got willing partners in the other states, we should be jumping all over that.
Sure. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
You had brought up affordable housing, and just wondering if you could kind of elaborate on what your ideas on that are. I mean, particularly from us living here, we're in the middle of a building boom here, and I just came from being at the Children's Museum before coming to this, and I swear 3 buildings went up in the Seaport District since the last time I went there. But at the same time, all of this is happening, and it's exciting to see this growth. But it's pricing out not only our seniors, but also people my age as well that want to stay in their communities and want to stay where they grew up, but they can't afford to stay here. So whenever people talk about affordable housing, I always think of it from that angle as well. It's not just our seniors that are looking to maybe downsize into a smaller place. They can't afford up an apartment, but also young families that are trying to stay, particularly around this area, and they can't.
Yeah.
So how can we kind of take care of both sides of that?
It's obviously a very complicated problem, and the dynamic you describe is being painfully felt here and in Boston, Somerville, and we need to be thoughtful about how we're addressing the affordable housing crisis so that we definitely need to add to the supply, right, which should ultimately help stabilize housing prices in the places where there's real demand, and relieve pressure on the affordable housing crisis that exists. And right now, it's clear that Boston, Somerville, Quincy, Cambridge are taking on way too big a share of the load. And a lot of the surrounding communities are not doing nearly enough. I also think we need to think differently about the tools we have to address the affordable housing crisis. We obviously need to increase supply, and that takes some subsidies from the state, either through public housing or subsidized private affordable housing, and for all income levels, extremely low income up through working class people who are getting priced out. And zoning is another tool, the stick, for getting increase in affordable housing supply. But we also need to think creatively, like transportation, like I mentioned. That high-speed rail, if we make Springfield a commute to Boston, it's an affordable housing solution for the greater Boston area. So first and foremost, what I would do is actually do an assessment and figure out how do we define the scope of the problem, and what do we need to get to in terms of a goal to address it. And what Governor Baker just announced yesterday or today about how he's going to try to get 135,000 new housing units in the greater Boston area for the next 8 years or whatever it is. It's not nearly enough. It's not aggressive enough, and it says nothing about the affordable housing crisis on the Cape or in the Berkshires, which also exist. But what is it we need to get to? What are the tools we have at our disposal? And what is a thoughtful plan that we need to put in place to get to that goal, to relieve the crisis, and doing it in a way that's thoughtful and takes all these different factors into consideration and actually execute against it? Right now, Governor Baker just spoke for the first time I've ever heard him speak on at least somewhat of a plan for the affordable housing crisis after being in office for 3 years. What's he been doing? This is a crisis. When you talk to businesses in this area about what they're concerned about, it's not the corporate tax rate. It's the transportation system and people being able to get to work on time, a trained workforce, and housing for their workers. And we need to work with a sense of urgency to address this crisis. And, I don't think it's rocket science. There are sensitive issues, and we need to balance community interests versus the need to increase supply in a thoughtful way. But it mostly just takes leadership and figuring out where we need to get to and what the plan is for getting there and executing against it.
So might there be some way to subsidize the development costs? And for individuals who've lived in the community 5 or more years, that a unit could be within a particular income or particular range,
Yeah,
and
sure.
it's subsidized by government or taxpayers in that particular community. That way, individuals are not priced out.
Yeah,
But there's a level. Developers want to make their money; they want to be able to pay their loans. So how do we increase CDBG, money as well as decrease?
it's kind of what I mean by we need to assess all the different tools we have available and think differently about them and think creatively about, and one other part so there may be different tactical approaches like you're describing to getting to some of the solutions to the specific issue that was raised. It's also looking across, in state government we have all these different agencies and resources that are used to help address the affordable housing crisis. We have resources at the local level. We have local public housing authorities. We have the Department of Housing and Community Development. We have Mass Housing. We have the Mass Housing Partnership. We have Community Development Corporation, all of whom operate in their silos with the pot of money that they have or the type of resource that they have and do their thing in isolation. We need one plan that we are coordinating all the different public resources and tools we have available and driving them as effectively as possible toward execution of the plan. Yes.
Hi, I'm Winnie. I'm the secretary.
Hi, Winnie.
One of the questions that I had, and it was brought up today, was a friend of mine lives in affordable housing, nice housing. She lives in good housing. However, the neighborhood is starting to fall apart. There's a lot of crime is starting to creep in, and she doesn't really want to leave her home, but she needs to leave her neighborhood. And now she's, looking here, looking at Quincy, unaffordable, looking at even more further, some parts of Dorchester, again, unaffordable. And I'm sure that this is a problem that's permeating throughout the state, is that you have housing, and it's relatively decent housing, but now your neighborhoods are starting to creep up with people that are robbing them, or, we just had in one of the neighborhoods the other night, a woman coming home that hit on the head with a rock. So it's one thing to build up all this new housing, but once this new housing is built, and even if it's affordable, how do you feel about what would be needed to keep these neighborhoods safe?
Yeah. So public safety is obviously a critical, fundamental responsibility of government and is really important. Everybody deserves to be safe and feel safe in their communities. Law enforcement's a part of that, and making sure there are appropriate resources for law enforcement. What I think we really need to focus on and constantly be focusing on and trying to do better at is addressing the underlying causes of crime. Poverty, homelessness, the mental illness, addiction, these fundamental underlying...
Increasing.
I'm sorry?
I'd say increasing.
Yeah.
Substantially increasing.
Yeah. So we need to do a better job of getting at those. And it's part of this whole debate that the legislature's been having, and I'm very supportive of, on criminal justice reform, which is about, we've been throwing more and more people in jail than we ever used to, and not getting better outcomes when it comes to the safety of communities. And a lot of times it's people just recycling through the criminal justice program. I think we need to be investing more in addressing those underlying causes of crime, making sure people are getting access to addiction treatment so that they aren't robbing people to get money for their next fix, that people who are mentally ill are getting the treatment they need, and that we're giving people, my whole agenda as a candidate for governor is about creating a new social contract in many respects that is helping address those fundamental issues that are holding people back, or that are resulting in many people falling down and ending up resorting to crime. Whether it's getting access to childcare or affordable housing or the education they need to be successful, minimum wage, so that if they've actually got a job and are working, they're making enough to support their family. These fundamental issues that aren't rocket science, honestly, but that are the difference between someone having a shot at being successful and feeling despair and that leads to crime, or not getting their health issues treated that leads to crime. So that's where my primary focus would be, wanting to do better. Yes, sir.
One thing that we used to have when I was in school is vocational schools, building trades.
Yeah.
Part of all the construction going around, trying to find somebody to actually do a repair in your house, can't find them. But then again, if you look at the education of trying to find some of the building trades and the vocational, almost non-existent right now versus what it was when I was growing up. Are you going to do something as far as building up the building trades, as far as vocational training?
Yeah.
To the schools, which are almost non-existent now?
So my understanding is that
not everybody wants to go to college.
Right.
Some of us can make a good business on a small business.
Our vocational schools in Massachusetts are generally considered to be pretty good, but the demand for them far exceeds the supply, and there are waiting lists to get into vocational schools around Massachusetts, which proves your point that we've got a lot of people who, if they could, would want to go learn a trade and take that career path, and which is a good thing and an honorable thing. And to the extent there's any stigma around that, we need to eliminate it. Not everybody needs to go to college. Mm-hmm. And we honestly, it wouldn't work for us if everybody went to college. We need people in the trades. So my sense, and I need to look into this more, but my understanding is that, and maybe the senator knows for sure, that we actually need more voc tech supply to meet the demand that exists. And that's something that I would be interested in trying to do something about.
Sorry to ask another question. The Boston Globe Spotlight Group just started a series discussing the issues with racism and lack of diversity within the state. Particularly talking, again, bringing up the Seaport District and how that community has just grown substantially over the last 4 years, but it extremely lacks in diversity. What are some things that you think that we can do to improve not only what our statistical standpoint, but also the way that the state is perceived? So we're not getting the SNL taglines and things like that we have in the past, particularly in the last couple of years.
Yep. So first, I think tone from the governor is important, and from all public leaders, that we are an inclusive, welcoming place for everybody, and everyone is equally important. And when the governor makes comments about it's okay for southern states to be flying Confederate flags at their state capitals, that is not sending the right message. So that's one thing. Another is state government generally, which is the only institution that represents all of us, right? It is our collective instrument. It represents all of us, which is one of the things I love about government. It needs to be the example. And it can do things through its own actions that set an example for the rest of other industries. So as an example, in state government, we have goals for when state government is doing business, whether it's contracting for construction projects, for public construction projects, or purchasing something from a vendor. We have goals that we're going to try to contract with a certain percentage of that money is going to go to contracts for businesses that are minority owned or women owned. We should always be ambitious about that from my perspective. I have also said, and this is one of the policies I put out on my website, another area we can be a leader is we've got a dearth of women and minorities on corporate boards and in corporate leadership positions across Massachusetts and across Boston. Another example of where kind of this issue that the Globe is highlighting. I have proposed that in state government, I would require that any large corporation that state government is doing business with, that at least 30% of their board is populated by women and minorities. That is an example of the type of thing government can do to say, you know what, we're going to set a different expectation here. And it forces companies to think a little bit harder and to act a little bit differently than they would on their own. And that leads to others doing the same thing. In the Seaport District, there probably were ways that government could have been more intentional about making sure that there were more minority communities involved in the planning and in the opportunity from all the investment that happened there. We're never going to be perfect, and there are limits and constraints on what we can do to force stuff to happen, but we should constantly be trying to do better.
Is everybody, you good? I just have one question. You talked about mental health and the single payer system. And if you were a CEO of a health plan, you must be aware that one of the least attractive areas of medicine as far as its the expense of the cost, mental health doesn't pay a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the real reasons we have such a drag on the mental health system. How would the single payer system help maybe equalize that? Yeah. That, you know, there's a lot of people that don't want to pick up mental health because it's not profitable enough for them.
Right. And you're right, because providers of mental health services don't get paid sufficiently, right, there aren't enough providers of mental health services.
And what is the biggest cause of most of our, quite frankly, social issues?
And we saw this in my health plan. The number one health condition of my members in the Medicaid program was addiction, of any health condition, physical or mental, and the second was mental health. And we often found, and this is proven in a lot of different studies and evidence-based work, that if you address the mental health challenges that someone is facing, it often results in a reduction of cost on the physical health care side of the ledger. And these two, for some reason in the healthcare industry, they grew up separately. There are physical health insurance companies, there are mental health insurance companies, and they've always been treated separately. And the truth is, we're one person, right? And we need to treat the whole person. And there are actually benefits to, if you help someone on the mental health side, you actually reduce costs on the physical health side. But the way our system's set up, it doesn't account for it that way. And so you often don't get the investment in the treatment that people need. Whether it's a single-payer system or not, and certainly we would need to do this, in my proposal we move to a single-payer system, we need to treat them the same and get rid of this crazy separate system we have, because at the end of the day, it results in worse outcomes for people and higher costs for all of us in terms of our healthcare costs. Can I?
You go right ahead, Jay.
Well, if there are two more questions, if there's time, I'll take two more questions, and then okay. I wanted to finish with a big closing. Yes.
On that topic, mental health, I have a family member who's schizophrenic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the system of halfway houses and places, a lot of times the families cannot take care of these people.
Yeah.
And mental health care system is
Disastrous.
it's ridiculous. They go in the hospital after a mental break and they're out of the hospital in like 4 days.
Yeah.
And then they're back on the street, or they're, luckily my relative has enough money to be able to, live in an apartment or live somewhere, but the halfway houses that he has lived in are horrible.
Yeah.
They're run down, that there's drugs in the house, the system is broken.
Yep.
And I would love to hear what you would do to help these people live in, a nice living, so they want to live.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these people commit suicide.
Yeah.
Because they just don't live like like a normal person lives. They live in substandard situations.
Yeah. So it is a huge problem in this state, and it's not unique in this state. And this is something that is also personal for me. And my sister-in-law is bipolar, and my family, my parents in particular, have had to make huge sacrifices because of all the different ways in which the system has failed her. And she's fortunate that she's got family and resources to help her when she needs them, but there are many people who don't. And that you're absolutely right, it's the same point Alicia's making. The system we have not invested in the way we need to. And I know it sounds easy to say we need more money to invest in this, but everybody who pretends we don't, or just kind of keeps it going the way it is, we're not gonna make the progress we need to in an area that we're letting way too many people down. And it ultimately probably results in higher costs at the end of the day.
And higher crime
Yeah,
rates.
yeah.
And,
So
ask any cop.
this is something that another example of an area we need real leadership that right now we don't have it. Senator.
No question, just a comment. Thank you. And everything that Jay says about how he deals with people, it's absolutely true. I've known Jay from, as he mentioned, when I was on the city council, Jay was bond council, and he did his homework, knew his facts, knew his figures, came prepared, was willing to listen, and worked well with everybody on the city council. And then as he changed roles, and as I changed roles, we got to work together again at the State House when Jay was Secretary of Administration and Finance. Very approachable, and same thing. Did his homework, knew his facts, knew his figures, and more than anything else, which I really appreciate, and I know other members of the legislature appreciate, was willing to listen and work with people. And then when he left state government and went over with Celtic Care, we met a few times on the opioid and mental health issues. And his interest there is genuine. He's interested in a lot of the data that's now being collected in order to help form or determine policy or drive policy. Rather than just kind of say, let's do this, he rolls up the sleeves and he dives in and really has a very thorough understanding of the issues. So, not that you need to be vouched for, but I just want to say thank you. It's been a pleasure to work with you.
Well, thank you for saying all that, and for when I asked you to come today and be here and say all that in front of everyone. No, I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me.